the NAB project, we were developing a series of prototyping tools which were about literally building a theatre set for ourselves and our client to improvise, to test the ideas about what is supposed to go on inside this design, and therefore to test ideas about the design itself. So in a sense, we almost went from that of our own thinking as designers and technologically interested to a kind of dramaturgical, anthropological position where we became very interested in finding narratives, understanding the possibilities for a particular design, and certainly by the time of NAB, recognizing that the client can bring fantastic insights to the design process and can make very significant contributions to the way in which the design progresses. And this is not about a client designing the outcome, but this is about us working collaboratively with our clients to design the brief. Yep. And in our thinking, the research and the prototyping essentially all focuses on the evolution of the program or the brief for the project. In some respects, if you can get that absolutely right, then 10 different designers could be constructed to produce what should be, each one though different, still equally effective design outcomes. So I guess we've made that a key territory for our work.
Now, in each of your projects, what you don't talk about often is the fact that they actually result in a lot of artifacts, a lot of objects, lots of different new kinds of tables or couches. So there are these objects that come out, and there's a whole series of experimentation and some sort of a frontier exploration of new kinds of technology that's going on. So just to sort of pause on your Acme work, what was that experience about, and what is the story of the pod?
I think the Acme project was most interesting in that it was, I think, our first attempt to combine the idea of space and object. So the project is a spatial project, and it required cinemas, tiny cinemas. And it seemed to us that the demands for scalability, flexibility and modularity and the reconfigurability that was being asked of by the client could be very well suited by constructing a kind of spatial version of a Lego system that we could reconfigure in lots of ways and move about. And for that particular project, the focus was to try and make objects that one inhabited. And so the scale of the objects kind of went up. But there are lots of little sub-objects inside it. So it's made up of modules that do particular things. But then they all assemble to make spaces. In the later projects, the spatial projects, I think we have tried to almost be a bit more abstract about the space itself. And the objects inform or construct a space by either a combination of information or electronics, as well as their arrangement, the arrangement of the objects, to force a sense of space.
There's also a lot of teaching that you do in your collaboration with Vail and before that with Chris Ryan, which is a slightly different take on sustainability. Can you tell us a bit?
Yeah, I think the Centre for Design at RMIT and then Chris's later project, the Victorian Eco Innovation Lab at Melbourne University, where our interests and Chris's align is his belief that in moving forward with sustainable design, you really need to create narratives if you're going to change the way people use technology or the way people, in effect, do things to change behaviour. And that this can only be effectively done if you present a new design as a scenario, as a narrative, and talk about how it's going to be used. And those narratives are a kind of prototype. And in truth, in a lot of those cases, the sorts of projects that we've collaborated on with both Vail and the Centre for Design and with Chris have been about making prototypes that are either real or narrative to demonstrate what the opportunities are for behavioural change, for using technology in a different way. So I think although crowds' interest in change is in many respects a kind of more modernist project about our love of new technology and its opportunities. Where the sustainability industry sits, or sustainability movement sits, from Chris's perspective, is about how you engage people in change, where that behaviour change is going to be good for the environment. And our two interests align very squarely in this territory of how to engage with change in a way that makes it desirable and meaningful and sexy. And in that territory, we've worked on a lot of projects together.
But you're excited about change for its own sake?
I think change is something that, to me, I suppose, is part of the idea that human imagination is one of the most extraordinary artifacts, one of the most extraordinary things we have as a species and as a culture. And that, in some senses, personally, I think that the more creative experimentation and the more creative output, for me, makes a much more interesting world. And so I think that underpins my own interest in this idea of exploration and experimentation and change. It's not a moral position. It's a kind of aesthetic one, or it's one that, in a sense, has to do with what makes life interesting. One of the things that makes life interesting, and in a sense, one of these critical things that distinguishes human civilization from other forms of life on Earth.
So there is a position in sustainability that could be aesthetic. Now, into the purely aesthetic, I've heard you talk about your passion for cars and how it is literally the place where a lot of the more experimental technologies find a location or find an outlet into society, or it's the place where the frontiers are constantly being sort of challenged and explored. But these days the car industry is not in a good place because of whatever. They haven't sort of answered the future, or they're sort of stuck in a position with what's happening to General Motors, amplifying the fact that they're not necessarily engaging morally with the future of the planet. No, your position, even with cars, is not one of being moralistic about cars. It is an aesthetic one too, isn't it?
It's an aesthetic one, but it's also a process one, in the sense that it became clear to me that certainly in the 40s and 50s and 60s, that the car industry recognized that if they were to take innovations, some of these innovations were substantial and others were purely superficial, but if they were to package those up in ways that made sense to the public, that they could put those forward and almost begin to create a territory or a vision of the future for people. And there's the line, the best way to predict the future is to invent it, the IDEO maxim. And this was definitely General Motors' position at the time, and Harley Earl's position, that if one develops concepts, does research, and then shows those, then you are beginning to take hold of a territory of the future. And I feel the crowd learnt an awful lot by observing what the car industry did, and the aviation industry too, to a similar degree, although a lot of it was directed at very small clients like the military rather than the general public.